Greetings, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome to today's edition of Tales from Outer Space, where I take stories from across the internet and read them for your entertainment. This particular story is called A Long War, written by YoshiiMan. What is my punishment, Your Excellency? Zakunu stood before the Stallark of the Itenia cluster, a being of such nobility that no commoner was allowed to know his name, one whose action carried sway over billions. And caught in the grand conclave, that same being gazed down at him with a deep frown. Yet all Zakunu could focus on was how large the Stallark was in terms of pure width alone. Around him sat members of the noble Kilupa family, more importantly, Ola von Kilupa, who sat as if he was pouting a child, sporting several massive purple bruises masquerading across his grey skin. Zakunu should have murdered the man-child for what he did.
As the repercussions for the assault and defamation of High Magistrate Capolo's dearest son, you will be placed on a repentance crusade for your honor and status with the mantle. A crusade under my personal command.
Pona Zakunu wanted only to wrap his hands around the beast being before him, cleansing the room of the putrid Stallark before him. The other part of him reminded that if he were to rid the Stallark, he'd only be lobotomized to serve as a tactical biomind for some old far-off royal official. All he could do was keep his kneel posture in front of the obese being, keeping his head gazing at the mosaic-tiled floors.
One of my position within the Mantle Navy,
Zakunu remarked, suppressing any anger or frustration that would otherwise be noticed in his voice.
Your position will be wiped, and land owned by you transferred to the Kilopos, and a 5 million credit debt placed on all future earnings made by you towards the Kilopos. This a 10% annual interest rate according to all future earnings, the Stallark casually stated. Though do not fret. I will return you to your place within the wider Navy once you have served your sentence. To the dismay of both me and the Kilopos, the Navy seemed rather stringent on my acquisition of you.
The Kilopos seemed to frown at the mention of the Navy. Thanks, Mom, he silently thought. The Stallark seemed to have reminded himself of the Kilopos' presence, turned his massive body to point towards the family.
Go, I do not care if you desire to gloat over him, nor do I care if you find my decision righteous or not,
the Stallark uttered with a tone of disgruntlement. The Kilopos immediately left in file the moment the Stallark finished his declaration, leaving only him, the Stallark, and the silent Praetorians in the grand chamber. Then the Stallark turned his mask to face him once again.
You will be my instrument of conquest for a campaign I've been longing to do. Do you understand, Commandant Zakunu?
The Stallark arched himself to look down upon Zakunu.
You shall take the 29th Expeditionary Fleet, working alongside 4 other expeditionary fleets under my fiefdom, and set about on a crusade of these primitives until every system of theirs is capitulated to the mantle, or specifically to my personal court.
Zakunu raised his head to meet that of the Stallark.
What are their crimes, Your Excellency? Their crimes is that of pestilence, the Stallark gestured. The filthy provisions have been pouring into systems under my name like damnable tinics, contaminating it with their filthy presence. You know the time, yes? From what I've heard, you are especially good at eliminating such filthy primitives from our noble lands, and that I thank you for.
The tone of the Stallark was jovial, a great contrast from the enthusiastic ranting.
I understand that you may be frustrated with the current state of affairs, with your requirement for repentance and all. Yet, please see this as more of a rejuvenating experience for you, allowing yourself to practice new strategies and all the things your military types do. All I ask of you is in return my systems to my fiefdom, and to remind these primitives of why the mantle reigns supreme.
Zakunu couldn't tell if he was being baited to respond or to continue his silence. He'd seen noble types always play mind games with those of lower stature, especially those who they had authority over. The bipolar nature of the Stellark marked one of the hallmarks of these mind games that were no doubt meant to coil him into submission. The Stellark calmly continued onwards.
Accept nothing of difficulty. Exterminate those in my systems. And then proceed to conquer those beyond the Outlands. I care not for what happens to those primitives beyond my systems. Just allow a ruler to have at least some subjects. One more thing of note. High Magistrate Kilobo will be overseeing your progress. His desire, not mine. You will receive more details from him, I suppose. However, you will keep him alive. That matter is not negotiable.
A few seconds of silence followed afterwards.
Why are you just kneeling, you demented tool?
Mind games it is. The Stellark's expression turned to that of jovial mood to that of fervent irritation in less than a second.
You have primitives to subjugate and systems to conquer, so do your job and be gone.
A vague smile enveloped Zakulu's face as he stood up to bow.
As you wish, Your Excellency.
Zakulu could only grin, gazing upon his work. The crude orbital construct that the primitive natives had set up across the gas giants were each belching fires, the flames cascading across the black void till the oxygen within had all but been exhausted. He glanced below at the planet, not even worthy of naming. Its forests were alight, or what little forest there were on the mudball of a world. What meager defences had been swept away the minute they had jumped into system. The planet conquered in mere hours. Now he simply stood admiring his own word. Perhaps Stellark was right. Even in all the decadence and aristocratic manners, watching insults to civilization choke on smoke and ozone was truly rejuvenating for one's soul. Was this what his mother had done when she was just an upstart magistrate, cleaning the galaxy of this filth, before rising through rank and battle to be a shining beacon of everything the mantle stood for? A sudden feeling of elation had driven through him at that thought. How she would be proud of him once she returned from the crusade. All trials and tribulations of the Academy, the Outlands, he would act as the godless sector of space, as a knight in shining armor. Just like the stories his mother once read to him a long time ago. All he had to do was wipe out 100 more systems like this one. This is going to be easy, Zakulu pondered to himself as he began to walk back to his ship's CIC room, already thinking of a myriad of different strategies that he could employ on taking on the next system. Zakulu could feel his face stiffen as the stare of 100 or so soldiers stationed lasered him as he marched through the smouldering streets of the primitive city. It had been a difficult day for the man and woman of the 241st Mechanized Infantry Legion. The fact that the High Magistrate had restricted the usage of even the barest of heavy ordnance in fears of damaging several artifacts and pieces of art belonging to these primitives was only one of the many difficulties faced by the Legion in the assault of the city. By heavy ordnance, the Magistrate meant no orbital bombardment, no close aerospace support, no artillery, no tanks, and only the lightest of armored fighting vehicles allowed for action. Zakulu was honestly surprised he didn't try and restrict mortars and grenades. Why the Magistrate even desired to gaze upon the filth which the primitives called art in the first place was beneath Zakulu. But he saw the consequences right beneath his boots, now submerged under blue blood. He could already see that the pool had emanated from already deceased soldiers, one of his men, whose torso had been ruthlessly cut in half, revealing the partially liquefied organs that had trickled around his boots. If he were still in the Academy, he would have vomited in disgust. During his first planetary conquest, he would have felt uneasy. Now he could only feel sorrow for empty eyes that now stood in front of him. The last 4 systems had equipped themselves with pneumatic weaponry that, while Neolithic in technology, could actually penetrate the carbon nanotube-derived body armor that his regulars were equipped with. The weapons themselves, as comically large, clunky, slow to reload, and unreliable as they were, they made up for it with vicious punch. A tungsten rod accelerated at Mach 4 through sheer pneumatic build-up. No fancy electrode railing or micro-combustion involved, with a rod size dwarfing that of the largest anti-material calibers so far used by primitive forces. The result of such a combination laid right before him, the soldier's lifeless eyes carving into Zakulu's mind. Yet his sense of pity was overshadowed by that concern. Their weapons had evolved. These primitives had now developed a type of rod capable of carrying ordnance while still maintaining penetrative capabilities, and the subsector primitive was particularly fond of fragmentation ordnance. He crouched down at the soldier to further gaze at what remained of it. A simple glance at the upper torso revealed what looked like hundreds of metallic shrapnel jabbing into the soldier's skin, having ripped across the remaining weave of the interior bodysuit. He could only imagine the bleeding such weaponry would cause. The sheer agony of 1,000 knives cutting you till you were all but dry. The Kuru grimaced. Fucking savages. Scenes like this were starting to become increasingly more common. With every system conquered, the following system would be better equipped, better trained, and better prepared. It wasn't a concern to his forces, seeing that they were at a staggering technological and tactical advantage compared even to other interstellar powers. And the primitives simply wouldn't be able to overcome the fact no matter how fast they advanced. Yet they were at a logistical advantage, an advantage that would only grow if Zakura were to push inwards, making every loss for him more severe, losses he could not sustain in the long term. It showed a trend that Zakura was starting to push into the more developed primitive sex, or that they were communicating through some means unknown to him, or, more terrifyingly, both. Zakura was leaning on both.
"Damn you, grotesque royal!"
he cursed under his breath. Well, it was undoubtedly known that the primitives he was facing were incapable of superluminal travel. The same had never been confidently confirmed on their communication capabilities. If only the bulging fool had bothered to do the barest intelligence of the primitives. It didn't change the fact that Zakura's men would be the ones to bear the brunt of it all. He placed his hand on the soldier's eyes, and in a final move of solace, closed his eyes shut. A part of him wanted to say that this was merely a fluke, yet deep down he knew that the war had only just started. "Comet! Comet! Comet!" blared the ship's klaxons. He could only stare at his AR, displayed the seemingly endless volley of missiles, drones, and torpedoes the primitive orbital forces were throwing at his fleet. For all the value a modern integrated Aegis pulse defense system had in dealing with deadly SSM munitions and stealth torpedoes employed by other interstellar powers, dealing with hordes of cheap, dumb, and numerous munitions was not its strong suit. He suddenly saw two purple blips displaying the escort frigates, Aiden's Virtue, and the light destroyer platform disappear from its display, marking the 8th and 9th ship he'd lost in this engagement alone. It was a painful stab to Zakura's heart, but he'd done the math. His strategy would result in the least spilt blood, at least to his forces. One of the deck officers calmly alerted. "Cruiser Panora has just suffered a direct hit on its starboard side, sir. Its reactors is reportedly on the brink of a meltdown. Captain Yusa is requesting to abandon ship. Your orders?"
"Permission granted, though order Captain Yusa to not scuttle her ship,"
he calmly said. That's now the 10th ship. These primitives, calling themselves the Jotunheim, had truly come up with a marvelous strategy. Utilizing the overlapping of the gravitational and magnetic fields of the various moons orbiting the gas giant Yggdrasil, they had seamlessly enveloped his fleet in ordnance of every flavor. Torpedoes, missiles, suicide drones, you name it, all crossing from every conceivable orbital path. He gazed at the red signatures representing numerous orbital weapon platforms and arsenal ships scattered across the many moons of Yggdrasil with the heated sigh of frustration. They just had to engage them a little while longer until his plan came into play. Meanwhile, a series of drone carriers orbited the horizon of the distant moon, coordinating their drone swarms with an efficiency that rivaled his own officers' capabilities. All the while, the carriers had an array of electromagnetic warfare destroyers and frigates escorting them at every moment, assaulting his fleet's point defense systems and sensors through an array of digital algorithms and AI in an attempt to jam any potential weapons lock. Not that it was actually working, but it was the thought that counts. With a single command, he could easily send a volley of torpedoes to eradicate those carriers and their escorts. Yet the primitives had a good saying for this strategy: appear weak when you are strong, and strong when you are weak. He did recognize the possibility of all this occurring, alongside the possible losses that his chosen strategy might occur. But what the Jotunheim had laid out was a true masterclass in orbital ballistics, so much so that he had to respect some of the calculations that must have gone into the fine trajectories displaying from his AR display. It forced him to stretch out his existing strategies, showing off their inherent weaknesses and flaws, before altogether abandoning the known in favor of something new, something exciting. So much so that he'd already managed to predetermine the outcome of the battle 5 standard minutes after his fleet entered the lapsing fields of Yggdrasil, a feat he'd never managed to achieve before. Nonetheless, he would respect the primitive strategy. Lamenter's Reach just suffered a reactor breach. Escape shuttles are reported inoperable. Crew assumed KIA. Captain Ufukura just reported complete drive failure on the Zamuru, currently drifting at 0.05 C. Time till impact with Yggdrasil 9 minutes and closing, sir. He could sense the morale on the bridge slowly fading with each new notification. He checked his watch with a growing grin on his face. 3, 2, 1. Then the bright white light signifying impact lit up as AR display, and that of everyone else's, followed by a moment of digital humming as the algorithms attempted to map out the trajectories of the resulting debris.
Gravity works both ways,
Zakulu chuckled to himself. Stealth-coated railgun sebos, each accelerated at various speeds alongside differing orbital paths, all for them to detonate in near-relativistic anti-ship fragmentation, inspired by primitives to deal with primitives. He gazed back at the AR display, smiling at the sudden disintegration of the primitives' inter-system defenses. Admittedly, only 86% of the primitive ships were destroyed or rendered inoperable by this Reich. But the various satellites and orbital stations littered across the gas giant would soon be rippled by a succeeding wave of debris unleashed by both the supposed and resultant debris. Meanwhile, his closely huddled ships would be synced in their magnepolar field, effectively neutering any ferromagnetic fragmentation, with everything else being left to the precision of his fleet's linked Aegis defense system. Those animals were truly onto something about using fragmentation weapons. It was monstrous to witness when you are facing such weapons, but also satisfying when you were actually using them. It had gotten to the point where he was tempted to ditch the charged turrets in favor of the Gauss-propelled slug mechanism. Though he'd have to arrange some meetings with his logistical officers who'd be quite angry on having to refit a strike force worth of ships for one commander, not to mention the extra logistical requirements that would be needed. But the crusade seemed nowhere near finished, and if he were to keep up with his current strategic objectives, he would need to rapidly alter his strategic composition and strategies to constantly gain the element of surprise on primitive forces. That, or he'd have to sever the methods of communication between primitive systems, emitter by emitter, starting with the Jotunheim's emitter. Soon, the entire bridge began clamping at the realization that the battle had been won. All of them were so hesitant during the debrief where he explained his strategy and his supposed strategy. He couldn't blame them. It went against all known mantle naval doctrine to engage in numerically superior and fortified orbital forces all at once within the gravity well. Sure, they had superior technology, yet physics had the habit of diminishing the difference two technologically different forces had. He would have to further engross himself in the art of orbital mechanisms. For everything the mantle had in technology, it seemed that they had forgotten the basics. And now that he was handling less technologically sophisticated ships than his Navy counterpart, he would have to start taking notes of primitive orbital strategic and tactical methods, though he could look at Jotunheim's specific orbital layout on a later date. Sir, several dozen atomic detonations detected across the planetary system. His heart stopped at the wording. Status of forces? Unaffected by the detonation, sir. Magnepolar fields have barely been affected by the blasts, though we have lost contact with a few recon drones near the inner belt. He looked upon the growing explosions registered across the inner planetary belt, spanning across the moons and various rings of the gas giant, all on the AR display. What were they thinking? Were they nuclear-armed torpedoes? Did they prematurely detonate? Zakula kept running on possibilities through his head until one thought suddenly came to mind. They're trying to buy time. "Ensign, what is the makeup of those foaming debris clouds?" he barked. The ensign seemed to frown in confusion at the results of her scan. "Polonium, sir. From what sensors are reading, the expanding clouds caused by the atomics have an extremely high density of the element." E. Ensign's oblivious tone to her own wording only infuriated Zakula. He could only imagine the smirk on whatever commander responsible for the last-ditch plan, hiding in whatever deep-core bunker whatever the Jotunheimers had declared as their capital, where Zakula wouldn't be able to strangle them lifeless before they popped their cyanide pills. Somewhere in the inner system laid a gravitational wave emitter, charging for a pulse out to the nearest primitive systems, warning them of his fleet's presence, makeup, technology, and tactics. For all he knew was right in front of him. The gravitational wave emitter, just past the growing cloud of ionizing alpha radiation, installed on some massive orbital or tucked inside a hollowed-out asteroid, Yet the cloud made any attempt to translocate the location of the emitter impossible for the time being. He would only be able to watch as a gravitational wave finally pulsed outwards to interstellar space. Just what the damned primitives wanted. The fate of this system was still sealed. The Jotunheim had effectively sealed their fate through their last gamble. The moons would be conquered, their bunkers destroyed, and their commanders thoroughly interrogated. All of that was now set in stone. As his temper started to growl back down, Zakura realized that the only smart move he could now make was to make preparations for coming assaults for those distant systems that would eventually receive the binary-coded gravitational wave. This time, he'd have to be more creative to catch them off guard.
Can somebody please explain what happened?
Zakura gazed at the pandemonium across the bridge, various officers, ensigns, and other personnel moving about, each in some state of panic or anxiety. He, on the other hand, had received a dozen notifications, marked all as critical from various captains, generals, and other high-ranking personnel throughout his forces, and he'd yet to bother responding to a single one of them. Part sleep deprivation, part of the realization that something very bad had happened. Then he looked at the overhanging digital display that acted as the bridge overhanging window. For everything that had happened across his campaign, across the systems he'd taken for the mantle, and the hideous sights he wrought upon them, this was something otherworldly. He was gazing at the cracked remains of a planet, the molten iron that once composed the mantle of the planet slowly expanding from the fractured core. Meanwhile, the remnant crust formations that once housed grand oceans and endless forests, now locked in a state of eternal blazing inferno. All of this as the planet slowly started to resemble that of an underworld of myth, a smouldering prison of flame. To say that it was a surreal sight was an understatement, yet Zakura could only gaze in horror. 18 million men and women that had been engaged on the planet eviscerated in the blink of an eye. Reconnaissance is still incomplete, Commandant, but we believe the savages have utilized a type of relativistic munition designed for, well, planetary annihilation. He lays it in to the young tactical action officer, who evidently seemed panicked about the entire situation.
Please explain, Lieutenant.
Well, from what I understood from the fleet's records, over 1,000 projectiles emerged from the local Kuiper belt at speeds ranging from 0.92 C to 0.98 C 5 standard hours ago. These projectiles...
Lieutenant, I only now informed of this, Zakura growled, attempting to contain the sheer frustration building in his voice.
The lieutenant, credit were given, was still locked on a parade rest stance, professionalism emanating from a well-dressed officer, bearing the noticeable amount of sweat screening across his face. The ship's persona only registered the projectiles as fast-moving debris, sir. Only after the sensors technician reviewed the minutes leading to impact did we actually realize that they were ordnance of some kind.
Debris? How does debris move at the precipice of luminosity without being noticed?
He felt a groan build up in his stomach. What other mistakes had the ship's persona been responsible for? He urgently thought. It was clear that the persona was either compromised or malfunctioning, most likely at the behest of the cursed guided electronic warfare AIs, or was it another primitive subfaction that he had encountered on his last few systems? He remembered that he stopped tracking his conquest after hitting 100 systems, or was it after he finally retreated from the cursed black hole and the nightmarish primitives after what he felt like a decade of attrition? How many years had even passed since he was ordered on the seemingly endless crusade? Though his ships supposedly were equipped to mitigate the effects of time dilation through some quantum foam phenomena he barely understood, it still didn't mean that time stood still for him. From the various anti-aging gene treatments to the cocktail of drugs he'd taken with the doctor's guidance, he would have been around. Sir, here's an ad hoc report on what we've been able to piece together about the attack. Zakura's inner monologue faded away, to remind himself that the very real tactical officer that now stood before him, with data shot in hand, seemingly unfazed by Zakura's more stressed demeanor. He took the shot and immediately jammed it into his AR port, disassembling the report before his very eyes. Its conclusion seemingly confirmed Zakura's suspicion.
Please change the light bulb, Lieutenant,
he monotonously said, the various officers still at their posts turning to gaze at him for a few seconds in either shock or confusion, before settling back down and executing a forceful removal of the ship's persona core. He would have the tech scanned and interrogated later for possible corruption and malware. Now that the planet before him was shattered, there was no point in having a persona aid him in bombardment calculations, though it would be an undertaking to requisition a new persona for his flagship. Yet the visage of the shattered planet, displayed on the bridge's various digital displays, reminded him of the more pressing matter.
Was there variation in size of the projectiles?
Yes, sir. The sensors highlighted that these relativistic kill munitions were organized in flight times with one another, with each wave having a different size configuration, which I can only guess carried various ordnance in order to have enacted a planetary devastation required to crack the planet, the officer stated.
Do we know the specific origin of these munitions, or how they were propelled to such speeds?
Another officer, having a gunnery rank denoted on a uniform, interjected before the tactical action officer opened his mouth for his hypothesis. The savages have ships orbiting the planet periphery of the system's outer Oort cloud. Zakula turned to gaze at the evidently sleep-deprived gunnery's officer, casually relaxing against his seat, in complete contrast to the pandemonium that still filled the bridge.
Are we sure of this information?
The relativistic kill munitions, from what LiDAR, passive, and quantum radar got, only had reactionary control thrusters for long maneuver burns or course correction, nor does it look like they had any solar sail equipped on them for third-party propulsion.
Why this conclusion, though?
Zakula postulated. This saves being getting better near lunar propulsion. Those pick savvies already demonstrated that when they managed to outflank us in Ikora, least to mention when they slammed the Illumi Spire with the cruiser at 0.6 C, this is merely the next step for such a growing tactic.
Preposterous, the tactical officer rebutted. Sensor detected the munitions exiting the Kuiper belt, not the Oort cloud. Clearly, the savages must have some sort of stealth weapon system in the belt. Maybe some sort of massive railgun installed into a hollowed-out asteroid, accelerating these munitions, coated with stealth material to be faint to detections until it's too late.
The gunnery officer seemed rather unfazed by the suggestion. That's what the savvies want us to think. Get us searching the Kuiper belt while they throw asteroids, nukes, and suicide drones at us. It's cheap, efficient, and psychologically draining. Everything the savvies love.
Then what do you suggest? The officer said, evidently attempting to deflect the imagined scenario. If the savages do have a ship transitioning at near luminal speeds, then we'd need to garrison various elements of outer and inner Oort cloud for intercepting this ship. Not to mention the fact that it could easily alter its course and head to the next savage system. Or worse, one of our conquered systems, something it may have already done.
That's assuming they have one ship firing all these kill missiles. I say at least 4 of these light huggers in system, probably planning to scorch the inner planets, just like they did here, before they run into an interstellar space to regroup with the next savage stronghold.
But they would be shooting themselves.
They don't care, the gunnery officer blatantly stated, with a hint of heat in her voice. Been throwing nukes on their own cities since the first couple of systems, and those have hypersonic tungsten rods. Then came the railguns and asteroids. This is merely the next evolution. The 200 million savvies vaporized on that shattered rock in front of us can easily attest to that.
The Kudu could only sigh at the suggestions. In any manner, he would be bogged down here for at least a standard solar cycle before the system's outmost reaches could be completely secured. Another cycle of interplanetary guerrilla warfare that would further exhaust his nearly broken logistical core. Though, on the bright side, the Stellark had managed to scrape together a full battle group to help alleviate his current strike force, evidently having some major headway in the conclave thanks to his past spectacles. New officers, soldiers, ships, and munitions, everything he would need in order to break the bulwark systems that had shattered every other commander but him, alongside all the manpower to finally put an end to the constant state of rebellion based on previously conquered savage systems. The new brand of savages, though, couldn't be confidently said. The only thing that he wouldn't be getting much of was senior military personnel. Not that he was expecting anything more. The savages seemed to have a strategic emphasis on eliminating any experienced divisions or ship, constantly training Zakulu's reserves of experienced seniors. Sure, the Stellark could have started putting on the Navy's vast supply of talent, yet body bags make poor recruitment material for such talent, alongside hinting at the true status of the Crusade. At best, he'd be able to find some mediocre talent desperate to make it big in the military brass, or worse, be able to attract politicians and nobles trying to find political glory. Ultimately, what it meant for him was more stimulants to get him through his ever longer days. His doctor kept on advising him against it, urging him that stimulants were no substitute for actual sleep. Yet every minute of sleep would be far better spent reorganizing logistical elements, informing himself more on savage tactics and technologies, and planning for further assaults into savage systems. More recently, he'd been getting himself used to a certain type of neurostimulant supposedly popular amongst the savages, coffee, as it was called by them. How he craved for the drink, solemnly staring at the shattered planet before him. The overpowering smell of burnt ozone, ash, and flesh filled Zakula's nostrils as he stepped off the shuttle's cargo ramp,
Out on the rapidly constructed forward operating base motioned thousands of soldiers and personnel, some preparing to journey back onto the front lines, while others ceaselessly carried weapons, munitions, and repair equipment to the armored brigade stationed at the FOB. What was more concerning was the amount of body bags that littered the area, some still encased with a body inside, others having been turned into a compact sack of ash due to the new self-incineration mechanisms the new body bags were installed with. Grim as it was, he preferred the smell of ash instead of corpses. It was an understatement to say that the hospital tents were overflowing. He read on the shuttle how his medical staff were struggling to deal with the new savage weaponry being utilized on the front lines, but this was far more hellish than what he expected to see. Soldiers lay packed together, each with horrifying burns, disfiguring wounds, and even some with bulging tumors, each one of them having an X or a different color inscribed on them. He could only assume that they'd begun triaging the wounded. Those who could be saved inside the scattered medical tents being given the full attention of medical droids and professionals, but those who couldn't be saved lied out and around the makeshift tents. A knot suddenly formed in his stomach, the realization of what he had to do. They were his soldiers in the end, serving with their lives to fulfill his will. It was only fair for the commander to be with his soldiers when their time came, just like his mother had told him all those years ago. He began to walk over to the pack of wounded soldiers, pulling out a pack of savage sweets that he'd found on this last ground excursion, his personal guards following along without question. "Hi, Commandant. Nice to see you here," gasped one of the soldiers, numerous tumors revealing themselves in her exposed torso. Zakula grimaced at the woman's face, only to be met with a grin emanating from her shattered jawline. "It's bad, isn't it? Damn medics refuse to give me a mirror." Looking down at the soldier, Zakula felt a growing unease in his stomach. Her wounds showed no traditional signs of Gauss munitions or comparable charge-like weaponry, yet parts of her abdomen seemed as if they were ripped from their soldier, forcibly so. The medics had done a decent job at stabilizing what was left of her, but it was evident that the soldier was suffering from some sort of internal damage, his guess being that the internal bleeding or blood clots. It still didn't explain the various tumors and seemingly withered skin scattered across the soldier's torso. He hadn't been alerted to any biological or chemical weapons in use by these savages. The fact that the soldier could even speak indicated that her painkillers were beginning to wear off, as every other injured soldier around her seemed too drugged up to utter a word. "You look like shit, Private," he said with the best smile he could give, containing the growing discomfort felt in his stomach. The soldier chuckled, eventually devolving into coughing of blood on her bloodied body armor. 231st Mechanized Infantry Legion. Remember us, sir?" uttered the soldier. Zakula's eyes peaked in surprise. "Were you there on?" He struggled to remember the name of the world when he first met them. "Who fucking remembers those days, sir? Been 90-something cycles since we started this mess. Only reason I'm still here was because my stupid ass signed the Centennial enlistment contract." The soldier interrupted with a massive smirk on the remains of her face. Zakula began to chuckle. "I got forced into this by a simple criminal offense to a noble. Meanwhile, you were stupid enough to be willing to join this crusade. I thought I was going to get a cushy garrison deployment, not assigned to an interstellar crusade. Yet here I am, dying on an alien megastructure, still as a damn private. Oh, how my dad would be proud." There was a brief silence between the two before the soldier decided to say something. "Commandant, I feel that I speak for the rest of the boys and girls of the 241st around us. Let us go with a quick bang, sir. The painkillers are starting to fade already." There was fear in her voice, yet more overpowering was the way her eyes seemingly begged him. Zakula rose his head at the various soldiers listening to their conversation, each wounded beyond recognition, each giving a nod to the suggestion. He looked to the pack of savage sweets, the multicolored balls of sweets. He put his hand out to the soldier. "These are on me, Private." The soldier took them from his hand and began to munch on the multicolored sweets, every bite illustrating the groan of pain on her face. He should have checked in her stomach was even there, but she ate the sweets with a smile on her face. He unholstered his chromatic charge pistol. In a fit of uncertainty, he glanced at his guards, each nodding at the motion. He lined up the hollow sight on the soldier's head and clicked off the safety. A tear fell from her eye. "These are damn tasty, sir." Then he pulled the trigger. The entourage of officers surrounded the marshal began to clap at the statement. None of them had seen combat save for sergeant representing the remains of the 241st. The pristine uniforms, the lack of any noticeable eye bags, and the lack of even the slightest grime, it was a dead giveaway. The officers before him weren't soldiers. They were politicians with military uniforms slapped on. "Marshal, have you developed an adequate report on these savages?" The Marshal took a couple of seconds to respond. "Well, my intelligence officers are still compiling the data, Commandant, but it seems that this is just a slightly more advanced savage subspecies, nothing that we can't handle." Zakura could see the artificial smile plastered on the Marshal's face. To anyone else, it would seem like a picture-perfect smile. Yet he'd seen the little marks of perfection, the one that highlighted a noble socialite in any given environment. He'd have to dispose of him first if he was going to get rid of the infestation of appointed Navy officers with ranks. Zakura turned his head to gaze at one of the soldiers of note in the room, looking at his ruined name placard before making eye contact with the soldier.
"Sergeant Mabry, could you please give me your analysis on the current strategic situation?"
"We're losing." Zakura was surprised at how quickly the sergeant responded, as did every other officer in the room. All turned their attention to the sergeant. "We've not had a single meaningful victory since we've landed on this ring. Every battle we won, every objective we held, was allowed by the Savis, because they lured us here." His eyes seeming turned to him with a traumatized gaze. "Every time we try to push beyond our objective, we get massacred. Yet the Savis never push us. They just probe us day in, day out, day in, day out, with their autonomous weapons. Every day a lieutenant gets murdered in his sleep, a supply convoy completely wiped, or a patrol never returns back. Not a single smudge of dirt or grime on their outfits, while we run out of body bags out in front." The sergeant looked at the various officers and personnel now surrounding him before gazing back at Zakura with pleading eyes. "Commandant, I urge you to pull out all forces here." The Marshal was the first to speak. "You speak far outside of your—"
"Silence!"
Zakura barked.
"I have more questions, both for the sergeant and some of the officers here, and you will maintain your silence until I have finished."
Zakura turned his head to gaze at the random intelligence officer.
"You, what assessment have you developed about the combat threat posed by the savages?"
"From the limited weapons we've managed to source from the battlefield, aided by 56th Engineer Corps, we can deduce that the savages are utilizing gamma-ray-based weaponry. I assume that you've already seen the effects of such weaponry from your visit to medical," spoke the intelligence officer.
"Sergeant,"
Zakura queried, turning his head back to the room at large,
"how does our current body armor fare against such weaponry?"
Admittedly, he could already guess from the body bags and the wounded he saw, but he needed confirmation before he made any hands-on orders. "Slight paper, sir. Our standard body armor was designed to deal with high-velocity fragmentation, Gauss rounds, and electromagnetic waves ranging from visible to UV rays. Meanwhile, these gamma weapons seem to bypass them with no issue, and the effects are starting to have a serious strain on morale."
"Please to explain, Sergeant. Speak freely," Zakura said.
"Well, the gamma bursts have a tendency to cause severe internal bleeding if you've been exposed to a high-powered shot and survive. They've also developed a reputation for boiling the fluids off, soldiers. It's, not that uncommon for a person's stomach to rupture if they've shot in the torso, and nanites can't fix that sort of damage alone. That's not even talking about the damned tumors. That gets to you. Every graze, near miss, and close-quarters shot. I saw guys in the front line who never been directly hit develop those tumors after a week or two on the field. That's not even getting into those damn savage Marines.
"That's enough, Sergeant."
Zakura already had a fix of horror stories from countless different battles. He didn't need another one to add to his recollection. But the sergeant didn't stop, walking towards Zakura and his guards while continuing to talk.
"You don't understand. They are deities of suffering, incarcerated into black-clad armor, with the fury of a dying star. When they get you, they do things to you. Nightmares."
Zakura looked at the empty eyes before him.
"Sergeant, I understand that you've seen things no one should ever see, but I need you to give me a clear overview, for both you and all the others on the front lines."
The more he studied the sergeant, the more disturbed Zakura was. His back was hunched to an unnatural degree. His movements were uncanny, as if the sergeant was a puppet on a string, and then his stomach was glowing red. An electronic laugh suddenly erupted from the sergeant.
"We found you, Commandant."
"Get down!" Before Zakura could blink, he felt the armored hands of one of his guards throw him down, as another threw himself onto the now glowing sergeant. Then he felt blood splatter against his face, and his ears popped. Gazing upwards, he froze at the sight of a disemboweled body that fell right beside him, the remains of the guard who'd saved him. As the shock wore off, Zakura realized that several pieces of shrapnel had found their place around his legs. Yet a short look around the room revealed a more grim detailing. Blood, organs, and limbs all thrown across the room. What was once a parade of officers now stood in an abundance of grinding flesh and bone, with scattered remnants once clean uniforms scattered across the scene. The sergeant that had once stood before him was nowhere to be seen, except the blood that now covered the floor and round the detention site. He could hear the screams and cries as soldiers busted into the room, only to find the gory scene before him. Zakuru didn't know how much more of this he could take. How long will it take to reach us? Beyond the heliopause sat a pinprick of light, ever so slowly, increasing luminance, comparable to that of a newborn red dwarf. Its source a single proton. Only 30 seconds, Commandant. It had been confirmed by a recon drone sent outwards to investigate the anomaly. One of the thousands Zakuru had started stationing around consolidated systems as an early warning system against increasing deployment of interstellar relativistic kill munitions. Are the jump drives still down? I'm afraid so, Commandant. The close-up images showcased a stationary sphere, 1 meter in diameter, and never consistent in form. Upon further questioning by him, he was informed that it was in fact not a sphere, rather a non-Euclidean geometric entity locked within negative curved hyperbolic dimension by his scientific advisors. Yet it was to be referred to as a sphere. Less confusing, less terrifying. Ignoring the scientific babbling of the science department about the several paradoxes that the sphere mathematical geometry brought with its existence, Zakuru, fascinated with the object, entranced even. The pulsating streaks of light revolving in a spherical form, punctuated by points of space-time darker than the void itself, seemingly collapsing and folding and then merging all at once. All of this a proton, folded to 6 dimensions at its current state, its true microcosm larger than that of galaxies, composed not of matter, as they knew, but rather the accumulation of strong force itself, quarks acting as structural elements, while gluons allowed for more trimorphic properties of the sphere. Those were the wordings of the scientist who was trying to explain dimensional physics to him. Zakuru had tapped out the moment they tried explaining to him how the sphere was only a footprint of a much higher dimension object. As he was coming to terms with his rapidly approaching death, a transmission appeared on his personal AR display, with only one message, savage in origin. He played it on open audio. How does it feel to be primitive? He could only chuckle at the question. He gazed at the flash of light before him, embracing its warmth for a fraction of a second. Then he felt nothing. End of story. I'd greatly like to thank our Tier 5 channel members, Caspar Arnholtz, John Creighton, Manatharia, 050, Dragzoon WRE, and Elijah Silvercross. Thank you very much.